Wanted to mention we haven't seen him in a number of weeks. Grant Loebs joins us on a monthly basis. Of course, if we have a big story that crops up in between, sometimes, of course, we'll see him more often. He's the Twin Falls County Prosecutor, and he's joining us this morning. He's also available to answer any of your questions as well on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. That telephone number. Might want to mark this one down, 7360300. First of all, welcome back. Long time no see.
Yeah, good to be back.
I sent you a link. I believe it was from the New York Times yesterday. There's a story out of from a border agent somewhere along the southern border. He was involved with a shooting. Two young men apparently came up and grabbed the border fence, and he was able to take one into custody, but apparently shot and killed one of the others.
Right, shot into Mexico.
Shot into Mexico, and now the Supreme Court of the United States says that he can actually, the family can sue, if not him directly, I guess, sue U.S. Border Patrol.
I don't think they've decided that yet, have they?
Have they come to any decision?
I don't think so. Um, I mean, it's a problem because, of course, there's a foreign government involved, and there are ways that foreign governments can, you know, charge American citizens, even if they're in America. And but that has happened. Mexico has charged this border patrol agent with murder, I believe, and the United States has refused to extradite. So then the question is, can the foreign people sue, you know, cross national lines? And this it's kind of a similar question that was posed a couple weeks ago
Saudi Arabia.
when the 9/11 people the 9/11 victims wanted to sue Saudi Arabia, and you'll recall that's something that Obama vetoed, and then his veto was overridden. And his argument at the time, Obama's, was that if we allow that, then other countries are going to do the same to us. So I don't think we've gotten to the end of this story. I'm not sure that that's been decided by the court yet.
Is there any precedent in something like this?
Boy, not that I know of, but I would have to do research on it. I don't know.
I was going to say we occasionally.
I mean, it's happened a lot of times. I mean, there have been a lot of cross-border shootings. Um, and the question is, when do you give foreign nationals in foreign countries American constitutional rights? And of course, you do if they come into the United States. If this person had been on the American side when he was shot by the Border Patrol agent, then he would be protected by American Constitution, and he would have the same rights that any of us have to sue or to be a victim of crime under the United States Code. But um, there's a little bit of a problem when you're trying to extend constitutional rights outside of our country to people outside, non-citizens who are outside of the country. And we've had, of course, that argument with the Guantanamo detainees several times.
There has we talk about things that have happened around the world, and infamously, this was fairly common in both the old divided Germany. There were people who were shooting back and forth at some of the dividing lines, and of course North Korea and South Korea and the demilitarized zone. But those are radically different stories than what would normally happen at our borders,
Right.
because we don't have shoot to kill orders, to my knowledge, that those countries had.
Right. And those are, well, of course, the East Germans and the North Koreans obviously shoot to kill their own citizens who are trying to leave those places. When United States troops shoot into those zones, which is very rare, they're doing it as United States military, and they're facing off against foreign military. So this is a different thing. This is a citizen of Mexico who's trying to get into the United States, and this border patrol guy, and I don't know exactly why he felt he had to shoot him. I read some of the information about it. Evidently, he claims that the young man who was shot was throwing rocks at him, and so he had therefore the right to use deadly force, and that's what he did. He returned the rocks with bullets and killed one of the two people. So That's what Mexico charged him with. They charged him with murder, but they can only charge him if he's in Mexico or if they can get him extradited, and the United States refused to extradite.
I do know from history that, and I learned this from my dad who was involved in it, that there was some shooting between troops from the United States and the old Soviet Union across one of these zones, and because he happened to be there taking part in it, and I said, "Well, what became of that?" He said, "Well, did you ever hear of it?" And I said, "Of course not, until you told me." And he said, "Well, that's because your government does a really good job sometimes of papering these things over." Of course, that was 60 years ago as well.
Right, and in those cases, like I mentioned, both in Korea and in mainly in Berlin, those things have the potential to be flashpoints for international incidents, and so each side wants to contain them as much as possible, and you're usually not going to read about those, at least not at the time in the paper. You might read about them now; they might be declassified
Yeah, and we want to point out if people would like to reach our program today, Grant Loebs is in studio with us until 10 o'clock this morning. Telephone number, if you'd like to contact the prosecutor, 736-0300. That's 736-0300, and we're coming up on 13 minutes after 9 o'clock. And we're up to 41. Looks like we may head into the low 50s today, may being the operative word with all of that. You can also email me at bill.colley@townsquaremedia.com. Second thing I sent you was a link from I guess it's a news link out of Minnesota, talking about what to expect. I think that most of us, if we're Republicans, we're aware that really good possibility. 538 blog says that Hillary Clinton, and I don't disagree with them, is likely going to be the next president. So the big fears we've had on the American right about a number of nominees, liberal nominees for the Supreme Court, is going to come true, simply because we have a lot of people who are either going to pass on, or we don't want to recommend that, but they pass on or they retire. There's going to be a lot of push and shove in Washington if she's going to be nominating people who are considered to be, as Chuck Schumer used to say, outside the mainstream. Well, this is coming from the other side now. Republicans may find that some of these people are unacceptable.
Well, I think the Republicans are going to find a lot of these people that Hillary Clinton wants to nominate unacceptable, perhaps all of them. But, if she wins, she's probably going to have the opportunity to nominate between certainly two, up to four, um, depending upon what happens with the replacement uh, that is currently vacant. Up to four justices, and I did read that article, and it was kind of a list of doomsday scenarios, kind of what could happen here, what could happen there. Will they just not consider any nominees? It seems to be pretty certain that they're not going to consider Obama's nominee, um, which I think Obama tried to tempt them with considering because it's somebody who's a lot less obviously left wing than a lot of the people that might be considered, and that certainly Obama would have considered had he been in the middle of his term. But assuming they reject or don't consider, the nominee that Obama sent up there, Garland, um, she's possibly got four people to nominate in even a 4-year term. If she were to get reelected, then certainly four, because there are three of them that are 80 or more. Um, and I don't know what the strategy of Republicans should be. I mean, that all depends, of course, on whether the Republicans keep the Senate, which is certainly not a guarantee at the moment either.
Well, we've seen President Obama just, I won't say he's opened the floodgates with prisons, but he's commuted a lot of sentences, let a lot of people walk who had some pretty nasty criminal resumes.
Hmm.
I think the fear is among people who do what you do for a living is if she brings justices along who feel that criminals have been oppressed or are victims themselves, that it is going to be wild out there on the streets and make your job all that more difficult.
Yeah, certainly the Obama tenure has not been one that law enforcement will look back on fondly. We've lost a lot of ground, not only with the most obvious thing that you just mentioned. I mean, just commuting the sentences of hundreds and hundreds of felons, and of course, he can only commute sentences of people that are in federal custody, not state custody. So, but still, I mean, he's already commuted more than anybody in history ever has, and he's not done. I mean, he's got time left to make a couple more big announcements. Um, and I don't think that there's going to be a whole lot um, of improvement in that way from Hillary Clinton. I think that her policies will be largely what Obama's have been. She's said as much. I mean, she says she's going to continue um, his criminal justice reform, and he's already nominated, I think, a huge number of federal judges, not including Supreme Court justices, which he's already placed uh, Supreme Court justices as well. So yeah, I don't think that things are looking good for conservatives as far as the court is concerned, or justice is concerned, or judges at any federal level are concerned.
This has been the warning, I guess, for years among conservatives is that you can survive the presidency of a liberal president, but it's the 30 to 40 years someone may spend on the court that will rewrite American history.
Sure, and the legacy of your Supreme Court nominees lives long after you're gone. You look at some of these people, FDR, Johnson. I mean, the nominees that they put on served for many, many, many years after they were gone, and reshaped American society in large part. And I think that's, of course, the goal of any president is to leave a legacy behind. And one of the most obvious ways you can do that is with careful Supreme Court appointments. I think it's becoming much more political, though. Um, I think since Robert Bork was attempted to be appointed by Reagan, I think that the political nature of the choices of Supreme Court justices had just been much more obvious, as well as the political nature of the opposition to them by both parties. So I think you've got a real chance that, along with Obama, Clinton's nominees are going to be very political and very left leaning.
And I can recall just some of the names from my childhood, people like Byron White, who, even though he was appointed by President Kennedy and confirmed by the Senate, he was a fairly moderate justice as far as that goes. And you didn't see a lot of these polarized decisions. Well, we shouldn't say that Earl Warren was there at the same time, but you
Yeah,
certainly
and
had people that were good jurists and they weren't political.
well, I think that we'd be kidding ourselves to think that the Supreme Court isn't a political body. It always has been, but I think it's been in the past more moderate than it has been in more recent times, and I think it's getting more and more polarized.
We've got more with Grant Loebs on the way, Twin Falls County Prosecutor. Also, if you got a question or comment for him while he's in studio with us, telephone number 736-0300. Bill Colley with you as well on Top Story. 20 minutes after 9 o'clock, it's 41. I wanted to point out our guest in the studio, Grant Loebs, is the prosecutor in Twin Falls County. Joining me, Bill Colley, this morning on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. He's also available this hour to take some of your telephone calls. 736-0300. And I believe we have a caller joining us directly out of the break. It's coming up on 924. It's 40. And caller, you're up next. You're on the air with Grant Loebs. Go ahead.
Hi. I have a question for well, I have two questions for him, actually. I make it my business to go to the arraignments on a daily basis, if possible. And I have noticed that the judges, whether it's 10 people that are arraigned or 4 people that are arraigned, 90% of them are released on their own recognizance, no matter what the charge is. And that there are very few of people from his office that appear before the judge to argue for these people being bonded out. And my other question is, how does he feel about court compliance?
I'll take the first question first. My office every day of the year, every single day, has people there to argue for bond. We have very few, as you said. We only have one. We have one person there who makes all the bond arguments at arraignment time, and that's the way that we do that for efficiency's sake. We don't have we don't need 5 or 6 people in there to make bond arguments when one person can do it. They only hear one case at a time down there, and my staff has the files for every one of them. Now, it is true that there are city cases that are held for arraignment as well. Those are misdemeanors, and the city prosecutor also has a prosecutor there. So there's a prosecutor from the city and a prosecutor from the county there for every arraignment. Uh, and my office and the city office makes arguments on bond that we believe are justifiable based on the factors that the law sets forth. The most important for us is the threat that a person poses, uh, the record of the person, the likelihood of them showing up. And sometimes the judges agree with our arguments and sometimes they don't. Um, I would disagree with the caller a little bit. It's not regardless of the charge. I mean, there are a lot of people who are released on own recognizance because there are a lot of charges that are, especially the misdemeanors, relatively low level charges. But the more serious charges, the more violent charges, those are taken more seriously by the courts, and as they should be, the bonds are higher. Um, but as I said, we don't always agree with the bonds that the judges give, but we are there to argue bond on every single case. The second question, remind me what the second question was.
Yeah, what was the second
About
question
Oh, court
again?
compliance, court
Why?
compliance.
How does your office feel about these judges sentencing these people to court compliance as opposed to putting them out into the community on bond?
Well, court compliance is essentially a pre-conviction probation. And so when somebody goes on their own recognizance or even posts a bond, they are required to go on court compliance until they are, adjudicated in the district court. And so the point of court compliance is to have probation officers watching people, testing, to see if they are testing positive for drug use, to make sure that they are where they're supposed to be, monitoring whether they have ankle bracelets and keep the ankle bracelets on. And that's the purpose of court compliance. Think of it as a pre-adjudication probation. That is a probation that people are on before they're convicted. Because of course, unless a person is convicted, they're still thought to be innocent, and they cannot be put on actual probation, which is a sentence. So the court compliance is an attempt to monitor people who would be either OR'd or released on a relatively low bond.
Does that help?
Well, kind of, but I still want to know, how do you guys feel about them ORing all these people? On
Well,
Monday of this week, last Monday, I'm sorry. I lose track of days sometimes. Anyway, last Monday there was a lot, Tuesday, because of the holiday. And of those that appeared, I'm going to say 80% were OR'd. And these were, second offense DUIs and things like that. And if you take the time to go back and look, you would be, I'm sure, very surprised that those people are turned loose.
Well, tell you what, we've got to answer that on the other side of the break. So we thank you for the call, and Prosecutor Grant Loebs will get back to that. But we've got a hard break coming up here at the bottom of the hour, which means 9:30. Bottom of the hour, a consultant once told me, doesn't mean anything to anybody listening. It's 9:30, and it's 40. Bill Colley as well on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. This is Top Story. Joining us in the studio this morning on Top Story is our prosecutor from here in Twin Falls County, Grant Loebs. Bill Colley with you too as well on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Telephone number if you'd like to reach the program today, 736-0300. The last caller mentioned OR. Now, that's an abbreviation or an acronym, right?
Right, for release on your own recognizance, which means that you are released on your promise to appear at the future court date.
And she suggests that there's a lot of that going on in the local courts.
Yeah, and I hope the caller is still on listening, but she She said just before the break, she said if I were to go down there, that I would be surprised how many people were released OR, or she said turned loose. And of course, I would not be surprised because, as I said, I have people from my office down there arguing every day. And when there's a bond decision by a judge that we disagree with, I hear about that immediately. And, somebody who's down from my office making the argument will come up and say, "You won't believe what the bond was today." So I know about it immediately. There are a lot of cases which, an OR release, which is a release with a promise to appear without a bond, is an appropriate release. There are a lot where that is not appropriate and a bond is required, and sometimes a very high bond is required. And, as I say, my office makes an argument on every bond, and sometimes we persuade the judge and sometimes we don't. There are three different judges that make those decisions, and each of those has a different philosophy about how to apply the statute and what is an appropriate bond on an appropriate case. So sometimes we agree with those judges, sometimes we don't. The only way to find out whether my office and sometimes often you know, we walk tandem with law enforcement on that. The only way to find out whether we agree with that is to find out whether the bond that was given is the same as the bond we recommended. If we recommend a $500,000 bond and the person gets a $50,000 bond, I guarantee you we're not happy about it. But the system allows us to make an argument and it allows the judge to make a decision. And once the judge makes a decision, then, that's pending, the possibility that we could get them to reconsider. That's what the decision is.
I'll give you some example of what might be a hypothetical, and maybe you can respond to this. A few weeks ago, a fellow who looked a lot like me got chatting with the attendant at the self checkout at the grocery store, and I was halfway home when I realized because I got so distracted telling jokes with the attendant that I hadn't paid for the groceries that I'd bagged. So I had to turn around. I went back. They had me unload them all at the service counter, and then I paid. But if someone had stopped me on the way out and I'd gotten arrested for shoplifting, likely I would have gone to court, and then it would have been said, well, he's got a clean past,
Mhm.
likely, and he's not a flight risk. So likely then I wouldn't have to worry about posting any bond in
Well,
that
probably
situation.
so. I mean, need to look at your record carefully to make
Yes.
sure. But sure, if your record was clean and the crime was minor, then my office would probably agree that you should be released on your promise to appear. You have a job, you have a place to be.
Mhm.
People know you and know where we can find you. You have support in the community in the way of family and friends, and the one of the reasons that bond exists is to give an incentive for a person to show up to court. And so if you post a bond of $10,000, then for a certain level of crimes you'll show up because you'll say, well, I don't want to lose my $10,000. um, but the higher the crime, the more likely you are to be found guilty. Then you start calculating in your mind, well, $10,000, but I could go to prison for 10 years if I show up, so maybe I won't show up. So the bond will go up. And then, of course, it's all complicated by the fact that there are bail bondsmen who provide the bulk of the money that's put up on their promise, and they take a percentage from the person who's posting the bond. So the rule of thumb used to be that it was about 10%. So if you had a $10,000 bond, you'd have to give the bail bondsman 1,000. He would put up the other 10,000, and then he takes the risk on you showing up. And then if you don't show up, you owe the bail bondsman. But there have been all kinds of changes over the years on how much bail bondsmen will take and whether they'll take credit or whether they'll actually take cash, whether you can put up your property to satisfy a bond. So it's a fairly complex, calculation now.
We have about 30 seconds before the break. I'm going to see if I can squeeze a caller in, and then we'll try to get
You
to
bet.
your question on the other end. Caller, go ahead. You've got to make it quick.
Hi. So I know of a local case. This guy has numerous child pornography charges against him. And when he was supposed to show up to court, he ran. He wasn't found for about 3 months. I was just wondering if you would know any reasons why he might be still out in the community after he was found. Yeah, I can take the answer on the other side.
Well, we've got a short break. We'll get back to that in just a moment. Do want to point out Grant Loebs is in studio with us. He's the Twin Falls County Prosecutor. And of course, Bill Colley with you as well on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. It's 39 at 940. Our studio guest is Grant Loebs. He's the Twin Falls County Prosecutor. He joins us on a monthly basis, usually on a Tuesday morning, just after 9 o'clock news. And of course, Bill Colley with you on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Telephone number to reach the program, 736-0300. It's 39, coming up on 944. Just a quick note, Dr. Jonathan Tripp or one of his associates will join us in the studio tomorrow between 8:30 and 9 o'clock. And you'll be able to tune in and catch some of that broadcast as well. If you have a question or comment about a medical topic, please feel free to join us. We do want to mention the doctor's office is looking for new patients. Tripp Family Medicine, located on Fillmore Street, directly across from the main post office in Twin Falls. Caller brought up we didn't get into specifics, so we don't even know what the case is, but he said apparently somebody's wandering the community who was picked up on an arrest of child pornography.
Right. I think the caller said that there was a person charged with child pornography, and they were either bonded out or were released on their own recognizance. I don't know. And of course, without the name, I couldn't check. And that they then ran, and that they were then rearrested. And I think the caller wanted to know, where are they now? First of all, I don't know for sure without knowing the name of the case, but that is not atypical, unfortunately. I mean, there are several people each year, many people each year, who don't respect the system. And even if they're given a low bond or um, released on their own, or even sometimes if they're given a high bond, they choose to run. What happens then, of course, is that they are tracked down, and they are rearrested. They are brought back in. They get another bond setting. They forfeit the first bond. So if you put up, say, 10,000 for the first time, you'd lose that, and then you'd come back in, and then the judge would say, I'm going to add another zero to that. Now you got $100,000 bond. How do you like that? And then they'll be in unless they post that bond, or sometimes if their crime is severe enough and they've run away and failed to appear, then they might not even get the bond the next time, or the bond might be so high that they can never post it. So that's the way the system deals with that. The system deals with people who don't follow the law and who violate the rules, every day in different ways, and violating your order to appear for your hearing, has consequences. The one thing to keep in mind is that, like with everything in the criminal justice system, the jail and the bond system function based on the resources that are available. If every single person that came before the court, that's 700 some felonies a year, and thousands and thousands of misdemeanors, if every one of them was denied a release, denied an OR release, or given a high bond, we would need to build many, many more jails. And that would be something that as listeners think about it, how many more jails do they want to build in order to make sure that everybody who's awaiting trial has a high bond and therefore is held in jail until their hearing? The system that we have, usually works. There are failures. There are times when a judge makes a mistake in what bond they give. There are times when the bond is reasonable, but the person runs away anyway. And those are dealt with as, exceptions to the rule. But in general, the system works pretty well at preserving those resources so that we have the people who need to be in jail in jail.
We need to point out, too, though, possession of child pornography is a serious crime, but a much more serious crime would be actually engaging in that type of behavior with a child. So, and this is where you get back into reasonable. Judges make these decisions all the time. That's why they're in those positions, is that one is obviously still far worse than the other. That fellow who might actually be arrested because he was committing those actual crimes with children, he's going to be in far more trouble, at least when it comes to things like bond, than somebody who's just holding the photographs.
Right. And again, it depends on the person, and it depends on the record, and it depends on a lot of things. The judge gets to read the probable cause statement, which is essentially the police report, in considering the bond, and he can consider whether there is a really good chance this person's going to be convicted, and he can also consider whether there's a good chance upon conviction they're going to be sentenced to prison, because that gives somebody a lot more incentive to run away and not respect the bond process. So, all these things are argued. There's a prosecutor, like I said, in every case. There's a defense attorney arguing on the other side in almost every case. And the judge makes a decision. And like I said, sometimes we agree, sometimes we don't. But, the decision is made. And if the person who is given the own recognizance release shows up for their hearing, then that's all fine. If they run, as the last example by the last caller suggested someone did, then they're tracked down. We catch them, we rearrest them, they get a bigger bond or sometimes no bond at all. So, um, that's the way it works. Absent that, we would need a probably a jail for 4 to 5 thousand people instead of one that holds 2 to 300.
Coming up on 10 minutes away from 10 o'clock. And of course, Grant Loebs, Twin Falls County Prosecutor, in studio with us, with me, Bill Colley, on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. It's 41. It surprises me. Every now and then you will see somebody who they'll skip out like that. And sometimes you realize they did it because they knew they were in a lot of trouble. But other times, skipping out is much worse for them than the minor trouble they were in, and that's the one that always throws me.
Yeah, it does, and you don't know what's going on in somebody's mind. You know, that also that in addition to what people will do to get out of minor offenses always has confused me. I mean, sometimes you'll have a person who's there accused of an infraction, and they will take the stand and they will lie about whether they were speeding or whether they stopped at a stop sign. And the lying can be a felony, and the infraction that they're lying to get out of is just a fine that goes on their driving record. It's kind of amazing to see how sometimes relatively minor things can really get a person in trouble if they just make the wrong decision all the way along. But anybody who's out there listening who is thinking, what would they do if they get arrested? Obviously, you try to portray yourself as well as possible to the judge. Try to get yourself the lowest bond that you can, or released on your own. If you get released, show up for court, because the minute you don't show up for court, you lose the bond you posted, and you're likely to get a very high bond. And now you've just made a lot more trouble for yourself.
Years ago, I remember I was covering a story. The local sheriff's department where I lived at the time had arrested a fugitive in North Carolina who'd run in one of these situations, and I still, because his name was so unusual, you never forget someone who has a name like Elmer Heffelmeyer, and he had gone to North Carolina and he had changed his name to Tom Heffelmeyer.
Well, there you go.
And
nobody will ever suspect it.
And when I brought it up to the sheriff, wouldn't it have made more sense to change that unusual last name? The sheriff looked at me and said, "You got to realize a lot of people have turned to a life of crime because they don't have the brains to succeed otherwise," and which I thought was a great way to put that. It wasn't very nice, but it was well said. But we're dealing with people sometimes who you just brought up. They don't think clearly about what they're doing.
Yeah, I think that's lot of the reason that people are in trouble in the first place. As I've told you on this show many times before, the overwhelming number of people that we come into contact with as prosecutors and as law enforcement, as police, aren't evil, bad, horrible people. They're just people that either didn't think what they were doing, made a stupid decision. Sometimes then they make another stupid decision to compound it, or obviously they're under the influence of something, and that makes it very difficult to make intelligent decisions. And as well, they can't make decisions when they're out on bond either, if they're using substances, and some of them are.
There was a fellow too that I covered the story of, and I had to do it. I had no choice, even though police officers I knew said we really shouldn't dwell on this. But a fellow had gone to the bank. There was a problem getting money out of his account. He was having a bad day. Everything in his life was crushing him, lost a job, lost a wife, and so he walked home and he picked up a rifle and he got arrested walking back down the street because apparently he was going to go back and demand his money. Now, he didn't commit any crime because he never got to the bank before police stopped him. And even they were sympathetic with the fact that they knew that this guy was having a nervous breakdown. And I guess every once in a while, the system has to look at somebody and say, all right, because he never committed any crime, he never carried anything out. But it was just
That's a pretty scary near miss, though.
near miss.
Yeah.
But do you ever encounter people like that that just everything in their lives that was crushing them like that, and
Sure, all
they
the time.
misbehaved?
All the time. And, the system is designed to take that into account, but depending upon the seriousness of what they do, it takes it into account only so far. I mean, if that person had gone into the bank and shot somebody, then the fact that he was having a bad day wouldn't help him much. If he'd gone into the bank at all with a gun, it wouldn't help him that much. But from your story, it sounds like they stopped him before he did, and so maybe got him some help and talked him down. But that's pretty frightening that somebody is having a bad day, and so they resort to a firearm against innocent people.
Road rage is along that line
Sure,
too. I mean,
similar.
obviously, you have people who, unfortunately, they're probably good, respectable citizens, and for 5 minutes they lose it, and unfortunately, sometimes with very tragic results.
Yeah, and we have some of those cases every year, and we have at least one or two of those right now where it looks like a person just lost it, and otherwise wouldn't have done it. And if you replayed the same event 1,000 times, they probably wouldn't do it. But we deal in actual facts, and if somebody did a thing, whether they did it because they lost their temper or they were having a bad day, or you know, obviously the excuse of I had too much to drink is used. Um, you have to take responsibility for that, and the system does try to, um, you know, take into account who you really are versus who you might have been for 5 minutes. But only to a certain extent. Depends on the damage you do, and it depends on the seriousness of the crime you commit.
2 minutes to go. Obviously, we will not talk to you again until after Election Day. You have the advantage, unlike a lot of your other fellow candidates this year. You don't have an opponent in the general election, but is there anything you would tell people in the remaining weeks? You'd still obviously like their votes.
Oh, of course. I am still on the ballot. I do not have an opponent for the general, as you mentioned. I had a primary challenge, and I appreciate the support of the people of Twin Falls County in essentially reelecting me during the primary. I still need to be elected in the general, so make your way all the way down the ballot and vote for some of those people that aren't opposed, because they still need votes to get in. My I think my desire is to get in for another term and to continue to do the kind of job that I and my office have been doing for the county, and to continue to show up on your show and answer questions from people who have questions. Um, with just one quick thing, some of the callers called with specific things today. As I've said before on the show, they can call the office if they have a specific question about a specific case,
Mhm.
because I don't carry 7,000 files in here with me every day to know every case's history. But if somebody calls, and if it's a type of information that I can give out in an answer, I will certainly be happy to answer questions from individual people.
And so the next time we see you, you'll likely be heading into another 4-year term. And
Well, yeah, with the new terms start in January, but I won't see you until after the election, and boy, then we're going to have an interesting election, aren't we? I mean,
yeah,
the last few weeks of this are you never know what's going to happen on any given day.
I do tend to believe that this is going to be one of those election nights where people are up very, very late.
Well, I don't know whether they'll be up late because it's close, or up late to watch the the craziness, but
You almost said train wreck.
yeah, I don't know. Uh, it's been unusual, that's for sure.
Want to thank you for coming by.
Thanks for having me.
Grant Loebs is the Twin Falls County Prosecutor joining us this morning on Top Story, and God willing, the creek don't rise. I get to come back and do this all over again tomorrow morning between 8 and 10 o'clock. Tentatively, Raul Labrador also scheduled to join us on the program tomorrow morning. Rush Limbaugh's show is up next following news at 10 o'clock from Fox.